Wait a minute. You were very concerned about it just a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
You said in response to a nationwide injunction on the Biden FDA's mifepristone rules, and I quote, "This injunction's a travesty for principles of democracy, notions of judicial imp."
Someone walked into this hearing with their own words ready to be used against them. They just didn't know it yet. What you're about to watch is what happens when a legal argument collapses under its own weight. Watch carefully.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it's great to have this hearing. Thanks for calling it. Thanks to all of our witnesses for being here. Professor Shaw, nice to see you again. Let me just start with you, if I could, Professor Shaw. You talked about the fact that there have been lots of rulings against the Trump administration. That's absolutely statistically true. I disagree with almost all of them. In fact, I think all of them. But the issue of this hearing really isn't the rulings, is it? It's the remedies. Would you agree? And those are distinct things. You may think that the ruling is quite correct, but that's actually not what we're talking about here today. We could have a hearing on that. Maybe we should. But we're talking today about the remedy. And the question is a remedy that binds parties who are not before the court, is that an appropriate thing? I mean, aren't you concerned about judges binding non-parties in their remedies? You may love the ruling, but even if you do, don't you think it's a little bit anomalous for courts to be going out there and binding parties who are not before them? I mean, is that something we want to encourage?
Senator, I think that judges have been issuing rulings that impact non-parties since Marbury versus Madison, right?
So you're not concerned about it?
I'm not. I absolutely think that they can be abused, and they have been abused.
Wait a minute. You were very concerned about it just a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
You said in response to a nationwide injunction on the Biden FDA's mifepristone rules, and I quote, "This injunction's a travesty for principles of democracy, notions of judicial impartiality, and the rule of law."
I think I've been consistent today. That was issued by Judge Kaczmarek in a single judge division. They're a problem. Those are a problem.
With him personally? Wait,
no.
Your testimony is if it's issued by Judge Kaczmarek, it's bad?
No, sir.
It's personal?
That is not my testimony.
So is the problem with the injunction? You were criticizing the universal injunction here.
Issued by a judge in a single judge division. I've been very clear today that those are a problem.
By a Republican judge in a Republican division, then it's bad.
No, Senator.
Otherwise, it's fine.
No, Senator. I think that single judge divisions are a problem.
What is the principal difference? I'm looking for a principle. I understand you hate the president. I understand you love all of these rulings against him. You and I both know that's not a principle. You're a lawyer. What's the principle that divides when issuing a nationwide injunction is okay, when it's not? When the Biden administration was subject to nationwide injunctions, you said that they were travesties for the principle of democracy. You didn't say the referral to Judge Kaczmarek was a travesty. You said his injunction was a travesty for principles of democracy. Yeah. So, in other words, the translation is just you didn't like the outcome. Is that right?
No, Senator. Look, we're talking about, I don't think Article 3 precludes this form of relief. So we are talking about prudential consideration.
This is the moment the mask slips. Not because of a gotcha, but because the professor just admitted it out loud. He said his view of the underlying legal question colors his perception of the remedy. That is not a legal principle. That is a confession. What you are watching is the architecture of selective outrage. The same tool, the same courts, the same injunctions, but the verdict on whether they are legitimate flips entirely based on who sits in the White House. The mainstream coverage will call this a heated exchange. It is not. It is a scholar conceding that his jurisprudence follows his politics. Drop a comment. Do you think any legal expert in this country is actually neutral? Or is that idea already dead?
Prudential meaning political?
No.
Then give me, so far I have yet to hear it. You've been questioned by multiple senators. I have yet to hear a principle other than the fact when you like the ruling, you think it's great to apply it nationally, including non-parties. When you don't like the ruling, it is a travesty for the principles of democracy, notions of judicial impartiality, and the rule of law.
Look, Senator, I'll say I think I am self-aware enough to know that my view of the underlying legal question, I am sure colors my perception of the remedy. I think that we should all acknowledge that. And yet I do think
and why shouldn't we stop nationwide injunctions for everybody?
I think that's
what we're talking about today.
Because I'm not willing to leave without relief non-parties who are injured.
No, you're not willing to leave without the ability to bind President Trump.
No, I think that...
I mean, when it's Biden, it's okay. No. When it's Biden, it's a travesty. When it's Trump in office, it's no holds barred, whatever it takes, right?
I believe in a powerful...
What was it that President Biden's staff said? We've got to do undemocratic, unconstitutional things to save democracy. Why isn't this the same thing?
I believe in a powerful president. I do believe in presidential power, but power and constraint are not at fundamental odds.
What is the principle? What is the principle? The legal principle. You've referenced prudence. You've referenced the judges you don't like. What's the principle of when an injunction binding non-parties, which was never done in this country before the 1960s? And let's see the chart, the Trump chart, which was done really only once Trump came into office for the first time. You don't think this is a little bit anomalous? You don't think that's a little bit strange?
A very plausible explanation,
law?
Senator, you have to consider is that he is engaged in much more lawless activity than other presidents, right?
You don't think
you must
this
concede that
was
as a
never
possibility.
used before the 1960s, and suddenly Democrat judges decide we love the nationwide injunction, and then when Biden comes to office, no, actually.
It's Republican appointees as well, Senator.
like
And the 1960s is where some scholars sort of locate the beginning
Can you
of this.
identify
But
one
others,
before then?
Mila Sahoni, who's another scholar of universal injunction, suggests 1913 is actually the first, and others in the 20s.
The Republic endured for 150 years before there was a nationwide injunction.
Well, the federal government was doing a lot less until 100 years ago. So there's many things that have changed in the last 100 or the last 50 years.
So long as it is a Democrat president in office, then we should have no nationwide injunctions. If it's a Republican president, then this is absolutely fine, warranted, and called for. How can our system of law survive on those principles, Professor?
I think a system in which there are no meaningful constraints on the president is a very dangerous system
That's
of law.
not what you thought when Joe Biden. That is not what you thought when Joe Biden was
every
president.
president
You
is
said that is
constrained
not what
and
you
must
said.
be.
You said it was a travesty for the principles of democracy, notions of judicial impartiality, and the rule of law. You also said
the Supreme Court, Senator, agreed 9-0 with me on that
You also
case,
said
to
when
be
Joe
clear.
Biden was president, you said the idea that anyone would foreign shop to get a judge who would issue a nationwide injunction was just judges looking like politicians in robes. Again, it threatened the underlying legal system. People were just trying to get the result they wanted. It was a travesty for the rule of law. But you're fine with all of that if it's getting the result that you want.
Sir, the Supreme Court agreed unanimously with me in that case, right? There was no standing. The case should never have been allowed to proceed.
Wait,
the combination of parties without standing and the single-judge division.
No. We're talking. No, they did not. They did not issue a ruling on the nationwide injunction. You criticized the injunction nationwide. Listen,
issued in a case where no one had standing.
Here's the thing. We've now gone 6 minutes, and Senator Kennedy had you for 6 or 7. You couldn't identify a single principled basis. We all know the truth here, which is it's not just you. It's most of my colleagues over here on this side of the aisle, who I respect a great deal, and they were raising very principled objections to the nationwide injunction just 6 months ago, maybe 9 now. And you're probably right. My point is that all that's changed in 9 months is the occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. And I realize that my colleagues on this side of the aisle very much dislike that individual, and I realize that you think that the rulings that he has lost are fundamentally sound. We might grant all of that. I disagree with all of that, but we can put that to one side. The question we're talking about here is, should judges, single judges, district court judges, be able to bind non-parties who are not in front of them? And you used to say no, now you say yes. Let's be consistent. I would just suggest to you our system of government cannot survive if it's going to be politics all the way down. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Can I briefly respond?
Sure.
I mean, you invoked democracy a couple of times there, Senator. Judges are part of our system of democracy. Democracy is not as simple as majority rule. Judges have always served something of a
You would have it be as simple as
function.
majority rule. When you get the majority you like, you're for the nationwide injunction. When you don't, you're not.
The professor just told you everything you needed to know, and he didn't mean to. When a legal scholar sits before the United States Senate and cannot produce a single consistent principle after 13 minutes of direct questioning, that is not a bad day at the office. That is a structural collapse. And what collapsed in that hearing room was not just one man's argument. It was the pretense that legal opposition to this administration is rooted in law at all. Let's be precise about what happened. Senator Hawley did not trap Professor Shaw with a trick question. He used Shaw's own published words. Words written when a different president was in office. Words calling nationwide injunctions a travesty for principles of democracy, notions of judicial impartiality, and the rule of law. Not a paraphrase, not an interpretation. The professor's own language, read back to him, live, on the record. And Shaw's response? He pivoted to the judge. He said the problem was the single-judge division. But that is not what his original statement said. His original statement targeted the injunction itself, the mechanism, the remedy, the democratic principle behind it. Hawley caught that instantly. Because when you call something a travesty for the rule of law, you don't get to quietly reassign the criticism to a procedural footnote 2 years later. But here is what nobody is asking. Why does this matter beyond one uncomfortable Senate hearing? because this is not an isolated case. This is a pattern. The same legal scholars, the same advocacy groups, the same editorial boards that spent 4 years of the Biden administration warning about the dangers of judicial overreach, of single judges stopping federal policy in its tracks, flipped their position within weeks of January 20th. Not gradually, not reluctantly, overnight. Think about what this means if you are sitting on the other side of this. If you are a voter who was told that nationwide injunctions were an assault on democratic governance, and then watched every institution that told you that immediately celebrate the same mechanism the moment the political target changed, what are you supposed to conclude? That the law is neutral? That the scholars are objective? Or that the entire apparatus of legal commentary is just politics wearing a robe? Hawley named it directly. All that changed in 9 months is the occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. That line is not rhetoric. It is the most honest summary of the current moment in American constitutional law. Now, supporters of the resistance to Trump's executive actions will argue that the scale and pace of this administration's moves are genuinely unprecedented, that the injunctions are not political weapons, but emergency brakes, that Shaw's admission of self-awareness is actually a sign of intellectual honesty, that he knows his preferences color his analysis and said so. And that matters. There is a version of this argument that deserves to be heard seriously. Critics will counter that intellectual honesty without consistency is worthless, that you cannot build a constitutional republic on the principle that emergency brakes are legitimate when your side needs them and illegitimate when the other side does. That is not law, that is faction. And the founders, who had read their history, were more afraid of faction than almost anything else. What both camps are missing is the deeper consequence. When legal credibility becomes partisan, courts lose the one thing that makes their rulings enforceable: voluntary compliance rooted in perceived legitimacy. The Supreme Court does not have an army. Federal district courts have no enforcement mechanism beyond the belief that their orders carry moral authority. The moment that belief fractures along political lines, the moment half the country looks at a nationwide injunction and sees not law but a political maneuver, the entire architecture begins to wobble. This has happened before. Reconstruction, the court-packing crisis of 1937. Each time the institution survived, but only because someone blinked. Someone chose institutional preservation over immediate political victory. The question hanging over this moment is whether anyone in the current legal and political class is capable of making that choice, or whether everyone has decided that winning the next cycle is worth whatever it costs the system. Short sentences now, because this is where it gets sharp. The professor could not name a principle. 13 minutes. 2 senators. 0 principles. The chart Hawley showed the room was devastating. Nationwide injunctions were essentially non-existent before the first Trump term. That is not a coincidence. That is a choice. A choice made by a legal culture that decided results matter more than rules. If this is the analysis you are not finding anywhere else, you already know what to do. The story does not end here. The Supreme Court is already signaling it may move to limit or abolish universal injunctions entirely. If it does, the same voices currently defending them will pivot again. They will call it judicial overreach. They will invoke democracy. They will write op-eds about the rule of law. And somewhere, someone will pull up what they wrote in 2025. The principle was never the point. The outcome was always the point. And until that changes, until someone in that hearing room, on either side, stands up and says the rule applies to us too, the system Hawley warned about is already here. Politics all the way down. Thanks for watching. If this breakdown hit different, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Share it with someone who still thinks the law is above all this, and drop your take in the comments. We read them.